In this episode, we share options and our solution for communication and staying connected while living on a boat. We are Malcolm and Rachel, and welcome to our channel. We share everything about our retirement lifestyle.
Hi there. Today we're going to have a slightly different video. We're going to be talking about when you're looping, how communications is important, and how you facilitate the communications while you're on the move. Basically, in communications, I'm not going to be talking about VHF and doing your radio calls and getting all of those things done. I'm more talking about how do you get your phone, your internet, your Wi-Fi, all of those things functioning so that it's seamless from the time you begin to the time you end. We all know that communications is extremely important these days, whether you're working on the loop or whether you're looking to get more in touch with your family, friends, and really receiving all that social interaction that you don't have to be separated from when you're on the loop and on your boat.
As Gold Loopers, having completed the Great Loop in 2023, we lived on the boat for a whole year. Being away from home and primarily outside of our own country, communication with family and connectivity was very important to us. We share various options and our setup and experience with our boat network and Wi-Fi solution.
So let's start. Here's a couple of options, and some I think, if not all, you'll be very familiar with, but some have pros and cons. So I'm going to go over some of them, and keeping in mind, I'm not an expert. I'm only giving you our view after we've done the loop and what we've used and how and what worked for us, as well as some views as to what other people have said as we've progressed through the loop. Options. So one of them is definitely Starlink. Wasn't really there when we started the loop, but certainly came in as we were going through the loop. The other one would be cell phones. Everybody has a cell phone, sometimes two, and all of your family and friends have cell phones, probably. So how would you use that cell phone more efficiently? Certainly, and keeping in mind when you're traveling internationally, because whether you're coming from the States or whether you're coming from Canada to the States, you have to worry about that cross-border and how do your phones, and do they still work? Another option is cellular modems. So, and what's the difference between cell phones and cellular modems? So we'll talk about that as well. And the others really talk to how do you integrate this, whether it be cell phones, Starlink, cellular modems, how do you integrate them into your boat? So how do you actually make your boat part of that communication sort of formula? The other one, of course, is boat networks. So a lot of people have boats that have their own networks, and we'll talk a little bit about that and how best to integrate other devices onto that network so you can use it while you're looping. So let's talk about cell phones. It's probably the most common. Everyone's got them. These days everyone's looking at their cell phone. The reality is cell phones are a great option. They work well. Many of the new ones nowadays, they're 5G, they're phone calls, FaceTimes, WhatsApp, all of those things will obviously continue to work for you. The carrier can become tricky, certainly when you're doing the international things I alluded to earlier. So we used AT&T in the States. We got a SIM card when we crossed over to the border. You've got to make sure that when you go and buy that SIM card that you can actually, as Canadians, purchase it. There are some funny rules about, you've got to have an address in the US and sometimes you have to have a US credit card. But once you get over those, we find that getting a local SIM card is probably the best way to do it. And in our view, we got a SIM card for the phone and we also got a data card. And I'll talk about that just a little bit. The phones themselves, you can share that with those in the boat. So in other words, if you want to create a hotspot, you can then use that with your laptop. You can use it to just basically be your network on the boat. Limitations, well, they perhaps have somewhat limited battery life. Are they always with you? If there's two of you and you only have one phone, is that going to be easy? And, the phone itself, although great for many functions, if you're both trying to use it as a hotspot or you're both downloading, uploading, or using FaceTime, there are some limitations that you may find with a phone. There may also be some reception issues as you get to certain areas. US, Canada. If you get a US AT&T phone, in many cases that AT&T number will work if you've got a roaming package with that AT&T plan. We hardly had any issues throughout the entire US. And that's all around, through the rivers, down across into Florida. Obviously, when you're going across the Gulf, we did the overnight. there's no reception there. But as soon as you get close to land, you're back in reception all the way across Okeechobee and back up the eastern seaboard. In Bahamas, which I'm not really going to touch on much, that's a little different story, but the process is the same. We got individual SIM cards from a Bahamian cell phone company. And again, every time we went into a different jurisdiction internationally, we would get that SIM card because typically that's the best way to ensure that you have consistent reception. So here's a question. Why do you not want to use a cell phone when you start talking about communications and boat networks? Well, there's a number of things that you can't do with the phone that you can do if you have another setup. One, obviously, is Wi-Fi sharing. So you can really share your Wi-Fi across multiple devices within your boat if you have a different setup other than just a standalone phone. The other is you can really look at integrating marina Wi-Fis. Although they're not all great, some of them are getting better, so you can actually bring in those Wi-Fi connections and use them on your network on the boat. So again, kind of free Wi-Fi that you can use while you're sitting in a marina. And when you're in the loop, most of us are going to be in marinas, often, maybe more often than you want to be. Then you can really alleviate the need to always use your own SIM card or your data card. You can use the Wi-Fi that the marina offers, which is a good option. If you have multiple devices, so some people have printers, TVs, multiple phones, laptops, all of these things require a connection to your Wi-Fi network. And to make sure that you have a robust connection, typically relying on one cell phone that's sitting somewhere in your salon isn't going to be the best way to do it. So let's look at options. Starlink. So Starlink is a great option. The RV version is typically what people use because the marine version is extremely expensive. And the plan is expensive as well. You have an initial cost to get the hardware, and then you have a monthly fee that will allow you then to use their product or their internet connection pretty much wherever you are. Now, there are some limitations that you'll see with Starlink. And again, we don't have it, so these are things that I've heard and talked to others that do have it. One of them is the speeds may not always be as good as advertised. In some places, they're fantastic and you can't equal them. But in some cases, they're not going to be great. So you have to realize that Starlink isn't a panacea for everywhere. The other is the power usage. So power usage on a boat, even one that is a trawler or a fast trawler, something that is fairly robust in its battery, it matters if you're running it 24/7. Starlink typically, as we understand it, draws about 7 amps, and that's not a small draw for a boat of any size. So unless you're running your generator frequently or you have a huge battery bank, 7 amps is fairly significant. I'll be talking about the solution we put in place, and I'll also tell you the power draw for that. Reboot times on Starlink. So reboot, although not a big deal, it's going to happen. They're about 15-20 minutes in some cases to reboot your Starlink and get it operational. That's an inconvenience. There are options that perhaps that's not the issue. Now, Starlink does come with a router, so in other words, it can be a Wi-Fi connection for your entire boat. That's a great thing. You have to mount it externally because you have to have that line of sight to the satellites. But, there's trade-offs. Everything in boating is compromised, and communications is just right along that compromised lane. So let's talk about cellular modems. This is what most people would use if they didn't have cell phones before Starlink came in. Some people use them along with Starlink in parallel. And there's a reason for that. Now, we used, and I'll talk about our solution, we used something called a PepLink. It was a Max Transit Duo. And that allows you to have multiple SIM cards, data SIM cards, that you can put into that, up to 4 of them. And that means you can have AT&T, T-Mobile, a Bahamian one if you wanted to, Canadian one, and that allows you then to switch between those SIM cards without really doing anything. Obviously, you need plans for every SIM card that you have. It also came with an external antenna that allowed you to put it up on your flybridge or on your mast, and that would pull in Wi-Fi signal that was coming from marinas, libraries, restaurants, and then it would make that Wi-Fi connection available to all devices on the boat. So in other words, you're sitting in a marina, you've been there for a while, they've got a pretty good connection. You can use their connection and actually use it to do the FaceTime calls or use it to get your mail without even knowing that when you're on your laptop, you're using their Wi-Fi. You don't have to log into their Wi-Fi. You keep logging into your cellular modem. So it's a big advantage from a cellular modem standpoint to have your own Wi-Fi connection throughout the boat provided by that modem. You name it something that's specific to your boat. You can have that antenna then extends the range. So not only does it extend the range to get other Wi-Fi signals, but obviously extends the range for getting reception from that AT&T or T-Mobile that is well in advance of what you could get from your cell phone. We had multiple situations where the cell phone had a weak signal, but the cellular modem had a very strong signal, and that was because it had a dedicated antenna that was pulling in that signal for us. So cellular modems are not necessarily the cheapest. When we bought it, it was probably way more expensive than it is now because now Starlink is a competitor. But there are some other advantages of having that modem. One is it's standalone. So we actually had that cellular modem all packaged together in a blue tote, if you like, small one. And it would come out of the boat, you'd unplug it, the whole thing would come out of the boat, you could put it in your car and you could run it in the car. The other thing is I had a network established and attached to that cellular modem. So I had a switch. And a switch is really just a box that you can plug in multiple network connections. So I had a switch that ran our cameras, it ran the Wi-Fi obviously, it ran the antenna, it ran the cellular modem itself, and the power draw for all of those things when we turned it on was equivalent to 4 amps. Now that's significantly less than what you get, let's say, on a Starlink, where you're looking at 7 amps. Now, some would say, it's not a big deal. It's 3 amps, who cares? The reality is when you're running that 24/7, and we typically left ours on all the time, you would be in a situation where, you wouldn't necessarily drain your battery, but you'd certainly notice that drop. So it gave us freedom to use whichever SIM card we wanted. It gave us freedom to go and buy data SIM cards without buying cellular, for your phone SIM cards. And when we did that, we went to AT&T and got a data card only, or we went to the Bahamian one and got a data card only. And that allowed us then to share that data across all the devices that we had running in the boat, including our phones. Just like if you were at home, you just look at that Wi-Fi connection, you connect to it, and now you're using your network that's sitting on the boat.
Here's a simple diagram of our boat network setup. We installed a PepWave Transit Max Duo by Peplink with its own antenna. Even without being connected to a cellular service or marina Wi-Fi, the network was created on the boat, allowing us, for example, to see the images from our boat security cameras on our devices. The PepWave could accommodate up to 4 data SIM cards from various providers, not regular cell phone SIM cards, but data SIM cards. In Canada, there are 3 main providers, Rogers, Bell, and TELUS. We used Rogers, and it worked even in the North Channel. In the US, the providers recommended to us were AT&T and T-Mobile. We chose AT&T and got a data-only SIM for the PepWave and a mobile phone SIM for one of our iPhones. Each SIM requires a plan to function in the PepWave. So at all times, all of our devices were connected through the PepWave to a cell tower nearby, and the only time we lost connection was when we were far enough offshore, like going across the Gulf of Mexico, or going across to the Bahamas. This cellular modem solution is the exact same technology that's used for Wi-Fi in other forms of public transportation, like trains and ferries, and also buses. Many of the marinas we stayed at offered marina Wi-Fi, and we were able to connect our PepWave to the marina Wi-Fi. Interestingly, we discovered that due to the antenna's location on the flybridge, our connection was amplified by the PepWave, and we found that the Wi-Fi was often better than if we connected directly with our iPhones. So to summarize, we created our own boat network, allowing us to connect all of our devices to that Wi-Fi. In the background, the PepWave seamlessly used either the AT&T data or Marina Wi-Fi data and would flip back and forth, choosing the best service. As a user on the boat's network, we could be looking up destinations online, downloading chart maps, working on videos, or having a FaceTime call, and all the while our boat network could alternate between marina Wi-Fi or cellular service, and we wouldn't even know. All we knew is that the PEPWave would automatically choose the fastest and best service for our boat network.
The other thing to keep in mind with these networks is they don't stand by themselves. These days, there's all sorts of chart plotter capabilities that enable you to connect to NMEA 2000 environments, so you can actually connect Starlink to it, so your charts can download using Starlink. Or if you have your PepLink connected, you can do the same thing. So when you're using that Navionics, Garmin, Raymarine Axiom, you can actually use those same connections that you're using to look at FaceTime or look at Instagram or do the FaceTime call to download the charts and the updated charts that you want to see on all of your chart plotters. So having that integration then provides you with an additional piece of value when you start looking at communication. So, for us, communication on the loop was primarily downloading our charts to our phone, updating those charts on our iPads. It was all the emails, because communication doesn't stop just because you're on a boat. You may be emailing to marinas, getting parts. There's definitely a lot of browsing to find the parts and places to pick them up when you're continuing down that loop. And there's significant amounts of social interaction that you want to maintain with your family and friends as you're going down that loop. That's an important part, so that you can tell people where you are, but also it's something that allows you to keep that contact even though you may be thousands of miles away in some river system. So it's an integral part of what I thought was doing the loop. Doing the loop, in our view, wasn't becoming isolated and sitting in your salon and every day going 50, 60 nautical miles. There's a lot more social interaction through the communication networks that you have. And this was just one method to do it. One last thing to think about is, how do you communicate when you go across the Gulf, or when you go to the Bahamas, or when you do those extended trips, let's say in the North Channel? Although we found reception for our cell service with Rogers, or with Rogers, was actually quite good in the North Channel. One thing we did do, and this is something that many people do, is we relied on satellite communication for those situations when we were going offshore, or where we knew there wasn't going to be any connections or available to us through our cell network. What we used was a Garmin inReach. We didn't have an ePerb, and if we were going to do a lot of offshore cruising, we'd definitely have an ePerb on board. But because this was basically a one or two instance, we got a Garmin inReach, and what that allowed us to do, you subscribe to their service, which is relatively cheap, and you can provide that information to anybody who wants to follow you. Now, family and friends, we provided a link, and it gave them a real-time view as to where we were when we crossed the Gulf. So normally when you're crossing the Gulf and you're relying on cell phones, you get 10 miles out, it stops. So you have no communication. And then 10 miles from the shore in the west side of Florida, it starts again. So all your friends all of a sudden see you and say, oh, there you are, and you can send emails. But while you're in that middle section, which is over 20 hours sometimes, you're dark. No one can see you. If you have some form of satellite communication, like an inReach, there's others, then you will actually allow all of the people who you want to know, they want to know where you are, will be able to see you real time. We left breadcrumbs so that I think it was half an hour, there'd be a dot on a map that would show where we were. The other advantage with something like an inReach is you can text. So you can actually send fairly simple text messages, or you can link it to your phone and create or type a text message through your phone and send that out. The other real advantage with it, from an emergency standpoint, you can send SOS. And Garmin, as one vendor, and again there's other vendors, has a center that when you send that SOS, it goes to them with the GPS coordinates, and that alerts them that there's an issue, and they'll do what they need to do to alert the officials like Coast Guard and SAR if necessary, to come and effect that rescue. So it was just one of those things that we thought, we have communications within the boat. We have cell communications because we had all our AT&T cards, but we knew we were going to be out of reach. And so that's one of the reasons why we went satellite with Garmin. It's a very small footprint. In fact, most of the time with that Garmin InReach, and again, not sponsored, you can actually take that InReach. I clipped it onto my life jacket and it just stayed on my life jacket. And the battery length was forever. So you could sit there knowing that at least you had that security if you needed it. So to sum up, communications is an important part of any boating exercise. Certainly though, if you're doing the loop and you may be there for 6 months, 3 months, a year, it becomes an integral part of how you stay in touch with people on shore, whether that's back at home, those that you're moving towards as far as marinas and parts. But it becomes a very important part of how you complete that loop. And I think for us, we used that cellular modem. It worked very well for us. It was a relatively cheap option for us, and it was robust. It just continued to work. And because we integrated things like cameras and other devices, it became important to us every time we were moving to make sure that all of that was working. So what you choose is obviously dependent on the requirements you have, whether it be a Starlink, whether it be just the phone, because that is a real option, or whether you use a cellular modem. I think it's important before you start the loop to just think about, how are we going to maintain that communications across those borders? How are we going to maintain communications if you plan on going in remote areas, so that you don't have to get there and realize that you're out of touch. There's no one you can communicate with. So it's a very important part of looping today. I think if you were to do looping 15, 20 years ago, it would be a very different conversation, far fewer options. But that's not the case now, and most of it is fairly affordable. So it's not as though you have to break the bank to go off and get these communication systems and solutions. But it's certainly something to think about before you start. It's difficult when you're on the move to actually get all the parts configured and working while you're moving. So just one thought as you go, in that communications have become a very important part of our daily lives. That doesn't change when you're on the loop. So hopefully this has been useful. If you have any questions, let me know. Comment below. And again, not an expert. This is just something that we've experienced over the years that we've been boating, and how we configured our boat to not only get us from A to B, but to make sure that we could communicate with people as we went there. Good luck to you in your communication journey on the loop, and thanks for watching.